356 seconds of silence in a congressional hearing isn't hesitation. It's what happens when a man realizes every possible answer leads to a worse question. When Jared Moskowitz held up a single FEMA memo and forced Stephen Miller to account for 47,000 missing disaster trailers, the room didn't explode. It froze because everyone understood the same thing at once. If he answers, he exposes it. And if he doesn't, the silence becomes the evidence. If you believe Americans deserve to know where $1.2 billion in disaster housing went, now is the moment to like, comment, and share. Because what unfolds next is not oversight, it's exposure. This is not a normal congressional hearing. This is a prosecutorial trap built in real time, where every document is a loaded question and every second of silence tightens the case. The setting looks familiar. Committee room, microphones, prepared statements. But the structure underneath is something else entirely. A timeline designed to collapse under its own contradictions. It begins with a number that sounds abstract until you translate it. 47,000 trailers, not units, not assets. 47,000 temporary homes, each one meant for a family that lost everything to a hurricane, a wildfire, a flood. Now imagine waking up after losing your house, being told help is coming, and then discovering the help itself has vanished. That's not a logistics problem. That's a moral failure. Jared Moskowitz doesn't start with outrage. He starts with precision. A memo dated March 15th. A signature from Stephen Miller. Authorization: immediate removal of 47,000 FEMA trailers from federal inventory. Destination: classified. GPS tracking. Disabled. Those are not ambiguous words. They are instructions. And in a system built on documentation, instructions are everything. So here is the first question that quietly detonates the room. Why would disaster relief housing, assets meant for American civilians, require a classified destination? These are not weapons. They are not intelligence equipment. They are mobile homes with kitchens, bathrooms, and VIN numbers. You don't classify a shelter unless you don't want anyone to find it. And that's where the logic starts to tighten. Because 5 days after that memo, every single GPS signal attached to those trailers goes dark. Not gradually, not region by region. Simultaneously, same hour, same minute. Which raises a second question, sharper than the first. How do tens of thousands of physical assets disappear in sync across multiple states unless someone orchestrated it? At this point, the hearing could still have been routine. An explanation, a delay, a bureaucratic deflection. But instead, something else enters the room, evidence stacking. Procurement records, manufacturer data. Cost breakdowns, $25,000 per unit, fully equipped. Total value, over $1.2 billion in taxpayer-funded emergency housing. This isn't surplus inventory. This is the backbone of disaster response. And yet, as the documents stack higher, Stephen Miller doesn't answer directly. He pivots. He generalizes. He talks about logistical considerations. But that answer doesn't reduce pressure. It increases it. Because the more abstract the response, the more concrete the evidence becomes. Now step back for a second and look at this not as politics, but as a citizen. You pay taxes into a system designed to protect you at your most vulnerable moment. You assume that when disaster hits, there is infrastructure ready to catch you before you fall too far. But what happens if that infrastructure can be signed away, moved without records, and erased from tracking systems without immediate accountability? Does the safety net still exist, or is it just a promise on paper? Because that's what this moment is really testing. Not just whether 47,000 trailers can be located, but whether the system itself can still answer a simple question when it matters most. Where did it go? The answer should have come immediately. Not a speech, not a paragraph, a location, a facility name, a transfer order, something verifiable, something that could be checked against records in real time. But instead, Stephen Miller hesitates, and that hesitation is where the structure of this hearing begins to shift from oversight into something far more dangerous: exposure. Because Jared Moskowitz is not asking open-ended questions, he is narrowing the frame. He already knows the documents, the dates, the sequence. The only variable left in the room is whether Miller confirms what the paper trail is already suggesting or forces the silence to do it for him. And silence, in a setting like this, is never neutral. It accumulates weight. So Moskowitz changes tactics. He doesn't argue. He doesn't accuse. He adds another layer. Satellite imagery. Not theory, not testimony. Images. March 14th. Rows of trailers sitting in FEMA staging facilities, lined up with military precision. March 21st. Empty concrete, tire tracks, nothing else. Same pattern across multiple states. Alabama, Texas, Mississippi. Not one facility. All of them. Now the question evolves. It's no longer, were they moved? That part is visible. The question becomes, who moved them? Because according to FEMA's own transportation logs, no federal vehicles were dispatched, no official drivers, no government contracts recorded for that scale of relocation. 47,000 units don't just drive themselves off a lot. That requires coordination, manpower, logistics infrastructure, and paperwork. There is always paperwork, and yet here, there isn't. This is where the narrative tightens into prosecutorial mode. Because the absence of records is not an absence of action, it is a signal that the action was designed to avoid being recorded. In any other context, that would already raise suspicion. In a federal disaster response system funded by taxpayers, it raises something closer to alarm. Then comes the financial layer. March 23rd. 8 days after the memo. A payment processed through DHS, $847 million to a company called Continental Transport Solutions, LLC. On paper, that sounds like a logistics contractor. In practice, it's something else entirely. Registered 5 days before the memo. No operational history. No fleet. No drivers. No warehouses. A company that exists just long enough to receive nearly $1 billion. So now the structure is complete. Assets disappear. Tracking is disabled. No official transport is recorded. And a newly created entity receives the payment tied to relocation services. That's not coincidence. That's a sequence. And sequences, when they line up this cleanly, start to look less like mismanagement and more like intent. At this point, the room isn't just listening. It's recalculating. Because if the trailers were truly relocated for legitimate reasons, there would be redundancy in documentation. Backup logs. Contractor verification. Chain of custody records. Instead, what's emerging is a pattern of deliberate opacity. Every layer that should clarify instead obscures. And here's where it stops being about one official under-questioning and starts becoming a broader question about the system itself. Because systems don't fail in silence. They fail when the mechanisms designed to detect problems are either bypassed or ignored. And right now, every mechanism that should have flagged this, asset tracking, financial auditing, operational logs, is either missing or contradicting itself. So Moskowitz doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. He just places the final piece on the table, the timing. GPS signals from all 47,000 trailers go offline at the exact same moment. Same hour, same minute, across different locations. That doesn't happen accidentally. That requires coordination at a level that implies authorization. And now the question sharpens into something unavoidable. If this wasn't coordinated, how did it happen? And if it was coordinated, who gave the order? And that is the moment the room stops pretending this is still a policy discussion and starts recognizing it for what it has become: a controlled dismantling of a narrative that no longer holds together. Because once coordination is established, once intent begins to replace coincidence, every remaining piece of silence becomes a decision, not a delay. So Jared Moskowitz does something subtle, but devastating. He stops asking broad questions and starts measuring time. Not metaphorically, literally. A stopwatch comes out. A single question is repeated. Where are the trailers? And then the clock starts. 10 seconds pass. Stephen Miller doesn't move. 20 seconds. An attorney leans in, whispering guidance that never reaches the microphone. 30 seconds. The air in the room tightens, not with noise, but with expectation. Because everyone understands what's happening now. This is no longer about gathering information. This is about documenting refusal. And then, instead of filling the silence, Moskowitz fills the gap with more evidence. Contractor payment records. The $847 million transfer to Continental Transport Solutions doesn't just sit there, it moves. Within 48 hours, the entire amount is routed out of the United States. Cayman Islands, Singapore, Switzerland. 3 separate destinations, 3 layers of financial opacity, each one designed for one purpose: to make tracing ownership as difficult as possible. Now the structure is no longer just administrative, it is financial. And financial structures, unlike speeches, don't improvise. They are designed in advance, which raises a sharper, more uncomfortable question. If the money knew exactly where to go within 2 days, why doesn't anyone in this room know where the physical assets went? 40 seconds, 50, 60. The silence is no longer passive. It's active. It's doing work. It's forcing every person watching, inside that room and outside of it, to connect the same sequence: assets removed, tracking disabled, payment issued, money disappears offshore. No explanation, no correction, no interruption to the pattern. And then comes the piece that shifts this from suspicion to something closer to testimony. A whistleblower, an internal FEMA logistics coordinator, not a politician, not a rival. Someone whose job is to track exactly the kind of movement being discussed. According to her account, on March 20th, 5 days after the memo, unmarked trucks arrived at a staging facility. No federal insignia, no contractor logos, drivers who refused to present credentials. They didn't check in. They didn't log entries. They loaded every trailer and left within 36 hours. That detail matters because it bridges the gap between data and reality. Satellite images show absence. Financial records show movement of money. But a human witness describes the mechanism, the moment where physical assets were transferred out of federal control without documentation. 70 seconds, 80. She reports it. She follows protocol. And what happens next is not an investigation. It's suppression. She is told the operation is classified. Executive directive. No paperwork. No questions. When she insists on filing a report, she is placed on administrative leave. That's not just a personnel action. That's a signal. Because in any functioning system, reporting irregularities is the safeguard. When that safeguard is neutralized, The system isn't correcting itself anymore. It's protecting something. 90 seconds. 100. At this point, the hearing has crossed a line that can't be walked back. This is no longer about whether something unusual happened. It's about whether the mechanisms designed to prevent exactly this kind of event were deliberately bypassed. And here's where the moral weight begins to settle in, heavier than any document on that table. Because those trailers weren't theoretical assets sitting in a spreadsheet. They were meant for people. Families displaced by hurricanes, communities burned out by wildfires, individuals standing in line for help that was promised but never arrived. 110 seconds. So when those trailers disappear, it's not just a logistical mystery. It's a transfer of consequence. Whatever benefit was gained on one side came at a cost on the other. And the question that now hangs in the room is no longer just procedural. It's personal. If the system can lose something this big, this visible, this essential, what else can it lose without anyone being forced to answer? 120 seconds becomes 2 minutes, and the silence has now hardened into something irreversible. It is no longer about waiting for an answer. It is about documenting the absence of one as part of the record. Because in a system built on testimony, refusal is not neutral. It is interpreted, weighed, and eventually judged. So Jared Moskowitz closes the gap, not physically, but structurally. He brings every thread together and places it, piece by piece, into a single line of logic that no longer leaves room to maneuver. A signed memo authorizing removal. 47,000 trailers disappearing within days. GPS signals cut at the same moment. Satellite images confirming empty facilities. $847 million paid to a company that did not exist a week earlier. Funds routed offshore within 48 hours. A whistleblower silenced for trying to report it. And then he does something even more precise. He removes the complexity. He translates it. 47,000 trailers. 47,000 families. That's the conversion no one in the room can ignore. Because numbers can be debated, but families cannot. Each unit was a place to sleep, a door that locks, a bathroom that works, a kitchen where a displaced parent could try to rebuild something resembling normal life. Strip away the language of assets and logistics, and what remains is simple: help that never arrived. At 2 minutes and 30 seconds, a voice breaks from inside the same political alignment that once supported Stephen Miller. A Republican member leans forward and asks, not as an opponent, but as someone who needs reassurance, "Tell us those trailers are helping American families somewhere." It is not a trap. It is an opportunity, and it goes unanswered. That moment matters more than the accusation itself. Because when allies stop defending and start asking, the structure around a narrative begins to collapse from the inside. Not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively. 3 minutes. Now the chairman steps in. Not to debate, but to define. Theft of federal property. Fraud. Obstruction. Words that don't belong to politics anymore. They belong to statutes. And once those words enter the record, the hearing is no longer self-contained. It extends outward, into the Department of Justice, into federal prosecutors, into a process that does not rely on speeches, but on evidence. 3 minutes and 30 seconds. The motions pass. Documents are entered. Satellite images become exhibits. Payment records become traceable points. The whistleblower is no longer just a voice. She is a witness under oath. And suddenly, what began as a question inside a committee room now exists as a potential case outside of it. And still, Stephen Miller says nothing. 356 seconds. That number will follow him longer than any statement could have, because it is measurable, repeatable, verifiable. A duration long enough for every viewer to feel it, to sit inside it, to understand that at any point within those nearly 6 minutes, one sentence could have changed the trajectory of everything that followed. But it didn't come. So here is the part that cannot be ignored, the part that extends beyond this room and into the life of anyone watching. If a federal official can authorize the disappearance of $1.2 billion in disaster relief assets, route hundreds of millions through a shell entity, and then sit in front of elected representatives unable or unwilling to explain where those assets went, what exactly is enforcing accountability before the damage is done? Because oversight, by definition, happens after. After the trailers are gone, after the money moves, after the whistleblower is sidelined, after the silence has already filled the space where answers should have been. So the real question isn't whether this moment will be investigated. It's whether the system is designed to prevent it from happening again, or simply to document it after the fact. And if you're watching this as an American, as someone who believes the system is supposed to work for you when everything else fails, then this isn't just a hearing you witnessed. It's a warning, so don't let it disappear the way those trailers did. Push this forward. Like it. Share it. Put it in front of as many eyes as possible. Because the only thing more dangerous than silence in that room is silence outside of it.